Okay, welcome back to Chapter 19, Empires in Collision, Europe, Middle East, and East Asia. And today we're going to look at the Ottoman Empire in the West in the 19th century. And this is where we come across our second of the three empires that experienced reforms that adopted some form of Western Reformation but opposed to Western imperialism. And here in the Ottoman Empire, we'll look at the Tanzimat reforms, just like we learned about the self-strengthening movement in China. And then the next set of notes will be about the Meiji Restoration in Japan. Now, Ottoman Empire is often described in European history courses as the sick man of Europe. Keep in mind of the greatness of the Ottoman civilization from 1450 to 1750. Think about analyzing the causes of the empire's decline, and we'll get into that. And even analysis that should include both internal and external factors. It's also a good idea to compare the declines of both the Qing dynasty and the Ottoman Empire by looking at the types of challenges each empire experienced and the responses that each had to those challenges. Both empires collapsed in the early years of the 20th century, and think about explaining the collapse of even the Russian monarchy as we get into that, which occurred in the same decade. And the examination of events like the Opium Wars really allows for you guys as students to describe differing interpretations of the historical process. View both the the British and the Chinese perspectives on the economic trade in opium, for example. So let's get into it. The Ottoman Empire in the West. Okay, for both China and the Ottoman Empire, they felt like they did not need to learn from the West. They avoided direct colonial rule, but were completely diminished. They attempted this defensive modernization, if you will, and suffered a split in society between the modernists and those holding on to their traditional values. And thus comes the sick man of Europe. In 1750, the Ottoman Empire was still strong. It was the center of the Islamic world. By 1900, it was known as the sick man of Europe. Up until the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was a great power of the Islamic world. And after a series of military successes against Europe, many viewed it as the great defender of Islam. And Europeans treated the empire with this sense of awe and respect. Yet all this changed. In the 19th century, the Ottomans faced a world changed by Western industrialization. And so region by region, the Islamic world fell under Christian rule, and the Ottomans couldn't prevent it. They lost territory to Russia, Britain, Austria, and France. And Napoleon's 1798 invasion of Egypt was especially devastating for the Ottomans. And eventually, and just shortly after that, in the first half of the 19th century, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania all fought for and gained independence. So, the loss of land to these different European countries, especially after the French invasion of Egypt and the subsequent de facto independence of those others, these various European powers just really chipped off more and more territory and just became very devastating. And led to, or was part of the decline of the Ottoman Empire. And a lot of that also had to do with they were unable to defend Muslims elsewhere. It was a weakened state. The empire had once been this great defender of the faith, but unable to challenge Christian states seizing control over Muslim communities, all the way from Indonesia to West Africa. And so the central state was very weak. The provincial authorities and local warlords gained more and more power, thus limiting the government's ability to raise money. And the Janissaries that had once been a unique elite fighting force became militarily ineffective. And so here comes this changing global economic order because the economy was hit hard by those Western developments. The Ottoman Empire had an increasingly difficult economic situation. European shipping in the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans decreased the flow of trade through the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and other trade routes that the Ottomans controlled. And with European industrialization, the Ottoman economy found it increasingly difficult to compete with the cheaper manufactured imports due to industrialization. And these factors really hurt their tax base and led to the state taking out loans that it couldn't repay. So a lot of foreigners had to step in and take over sections of the economy, and thus even like the British seized Egypt and its wealth in 1882 and building that Suez Canal. And so thus, the Europeans there achieved direct access to Asia, and those cheap European manufactured goods really hurt the Ottoman artisans. And that's the devastating part of the Ottoman economy. And those foreign merchants won immunity from the Ottoman laws and taxes because more and more European countries gained control, especially economically. And as the government relied on those foreign loans to finance their economic development efforts, they became dependent on Europeans. All right, here is a map that shows the Ottoman Empire, as you see outlined here in red, and all these different parts. And you can see, based on the years, the territory that they lost. And you can see it starts out here on the outskirts, which, as you can see, is what's closer to Europe. And that's what's interesting here. And eventually, in the latter part of the 19th century, they lose a significant amount of territory, and now not just in Europe and parts of North Asia, but really getting into parts of Southwest Asia as well, and Northern Africa. And so in this 1800 to 1914 time period, the Ottoman Empire had significantly decreased by size. It was probably about just a third of what it had once been. And notice the year 1914, the onset of World War I, because after World War I, the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. Okay, reform and its opponents. So the Ottomans attempted rather ambitious reforms, going considerably further than the Chinese. They didn't have an internal crisis on the scale of that of China. There was no internal upheaval at the core of their empire, and they didn't have to deal with a really huge explosive population growth that the Chinese did. And the rulers were Turkic and Muslim. They weren't foreign like the Qing in China, being of Manchu descent. And in the late 18th century, Selim III tried to establish new military and administrative structures. He sent ambassadors to study European methods and learn. He imported European advisors to come and teach. And they even established technical schools. So here we see a different reaction to Western military. And with this Sultan Selim III, he began to use Western military advisors as opposed to working against them. And so here in the late 18th century, these religious leaders and the elite janissaries, even though they argued against European intrusion into this essential Ottoman center of power, they still used them. Unfortunately, in 1807, the Sultan was overthrown and murdered, thus ushering in the Tanzimat period. In 1839, it was far more reaching measures. And this is the Tanzimat reorganization that emerged. And they started the beginning of an extensive process of industrialization and modernization, really with that acceptance of the principle that all citizens are equal before the law. And this is huge in a very religious state as they attempt this move towards secularism. There was also a tide of secular legislation and secular schools formed, which is out of the norm for Islamic communities. And they created even some modest educational openings for women, which were located mostly in Istanbul, the capital. And there was even, it's incredible. During this Tanzimat era, the Ottoman state engaged in widespread reform. There was really a defensive modernization. Importantly, the Ottoman leadership established religious tolerance and legal equality for all, leading to the promotion of various Christians to high office. And these reforms pursued a Western form of modernity using law codes and court systems that were modeled after those of Europe, as well as building a technological infrastructure. And the reforms opened women for greater access to public life. And the supporters of reform saw the Ottoman Empire as becoming a more secular state. The reform created a new class of writers known as the Young Ottomans. And they really urged the creation of a constitutional regime. They favored a more democratic style of rule with a constitution, the goal of saving their Islamic community from European threats at the same time. And they embraced Western technology and science, but they rejected the Western materialism. And in 1876, they had a brief victory as the new Sultan, Abd al-Hamid, accepted their new constitution, this elected parliament and a constitution, but soon faced a lot of pressure from Russia and returned to a more despotic type of rule for the next 3 decades. So he, not liking the limitations put on his authority, he almost immediately suspended it. And then, like I said, with that invasion pressure from Russia, returned to a more despotic or absolute type of ruler. And an opposition to that really coalesced in what's known as the Young Turks. And these are military and civilian elites. They advocated a militant, secular public life. And they really helped institute a shift to thinking in terms of a Turkish national state as opposed to an Ottoman empire. And a military coup was formed in 1908. It gave the Young Turks real power. They antagonized the non-Turkic peoples in the Ottoman Empire, which stimulated Arab and other nationalisms within the Ottoman Empire. And by the end of World War I, completely disintegrated. And so the Young Turks were really after secular modernism. They were frustrated with this renewed despotism by Abd al-Hamid. And so these military and civilian elites formed a movement. They were secular modernizers, and they actually seized power in that military coup, and pushing the empire towards really an unapologetic European path to modernity. And the Young Turks established radical secularization policy for schools, courts, law codes. They opened up schools for women, made divorce easier. And women were also allowed to wear Western dress, and polygamy was even restricted. And so the Turkish nationalism of the movement did antagonize non-Turks like the Arabs and even Armenians. And this Young Turk movement set in motion the key principles for the Turkish Republic after World War I. And Turkey, even today, really aims to, despite their rich history with Islam and most of its population Muslim, they still take pride in their forming of a secular state and really identifying more with Europe than with Asia. They've been trying to get into the EU, for example, for a long time. So really aiming towards that. Okay. I've got an image here that it's pretty cool. And you can see some of the different things going on here. Flags of different countries gathering together. You can see the Turkish in their very identifiable fez hats right here, and it's kind of like here's the city right here in the background. This one, I believe, is in your textbook. But you can see the coming together of support for the Turkish people and their new constitution. Albeit it was a short-lived era, it still was a political victory for those young Ottomans. And the country here is represented by an unveiled woman, looks like being released from her chains. And we have an angel here that's carrying a banner. And it's actually inscribed with the French slogan, or the slogan from the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. So it's really excellent image that shows a great representation of that event. And let's talk about the outcomes when comparing China and the Ottoman Empire. By 1900, both China and the Ottoman Empire were basically semi-colonies. They were under the economic and somewhat political control of others. And both gave rise to a new nationalist conception of society. Right in China, ridding the Chinese territory of foreigners, and with the Ottomans, this new Turkish nationalism that formed. In China, the imperial system collapsed in 1911, and that was followed by a huge, vast revolution and the creation of a communist regime within 30 years, by 1949, in that same territory. And the Ottoman Empire, like I said, collapsed after World War I. The Chinese revolutionaries rejected the old traditional Confucian culture, much more so than the Turkish leaders rejected Islam, even though the Turkish leaders aimed for a more secular state. Okay, and that is it for the Ottoman Empire and the West in the 19th century.